Good morning and welcome, everybody. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Director of Communications here at the Middle East Institute. Thank you for joining today's discussion. Our on-the-record session will discuss Gaza's uncertain future. Earlier this month, a U.S. proposed ceasefire went into effect in Gaza, marking an alleged end to a two-year war. The ceasefire was tested this past weekend. Are we now in a post-war phase? And if so, what does a sustainable, lasting solution look like in Gaza? To help us break it down, we're joined by Natan Sachs, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute, as well as Ibrahim Dalalsha, Founder and Director of the Horizon Center for Political Studies and Media Outreach. Ibrahim served for 2 decades as a senior political advisor at the US Consulate General in Jerusalem, where he advised US officials on the peace process, Palestinian politics, and state-building efforts. Thank you both for joining us today. All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. All right, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. If you'd like to ask a question, we will have a substantial Q&A segment. So if you'd like to ask a question, you're welcome to either use the raise hand function here on Zoom, and then if selected, we'll unmute you and you could direct your question to one or both of our panelists, or you're also welcome to type your questions in the Q&A chat box here on Zoom, and I'll read them to the panelists. Let me get started with you, Natan, first. How would you assess the current ceasefire? What does the fragility we're already seeing tell us about the underlying dynamics at play?
Thank you, Zaina, and it's a pleasure to be with Ibrahim, especially from Ramallah. And thank you all for joining. I think, like probably most people on this call, I'm on the one hand ecstatic that we've arrived at this moment. It is much, much better than where we were 2 weeks ago. But on the other hand, very skeptical, of course. This ceasefire was brought about to a large degree by the will of President Trump and the convergence of the will of regional partners. Trump putting a lot of pressure on Israel, and regional partners, especially the Qataris, putting a lot of pressure on Hamas, and therefore producing a ceasefire, a real one. It is very different than we were before, but it is also very tentative, and it is far short of the promise of the 20-point plan. In particular, I wrote for MEI recently, both parties entered this somewhat disingenuously. The Israelis were very happy to get all living hostages back. They are extremely dismayed by the slow pace of return of the bodies that were supposed to be returned already. But they did not really believe that Hamas would disarm or that it would stay out of the governance of Gaza in the day after. Hamas never publicly said it would, although it was required to. And Israel never intended really to give up the option of fighting back. Both its withdrawal is very limited. It still is in more than half, a little bit more than half probably, of the Gaza Strip. And as is firing back immediately, as we saw a fire on Israeli troops in Rafah and immediately deadly fire coming back. So it's very tentative, and it's tentative partly because neither party actually believes the full ceasefire will happen. However, and this is a big however, as I said in the beginning, we're in a much better state than we were 2 weeks ago. And moreover, the desire of the main parties who brought about this moment still stands. President Trump and his team, Vice President Vance is there right now, as well as Kushner and Witkoff. Trump does not want this war to come back. He has declared it over, and he would like the world to, the universe to acquiesce to this desire. And the partners of Hamas gained a lot, especially the Qataris gained a lot in this context. And so there are incentives pushing towards a tentative, partial, weak ceasefire somehow holding. There's zero guarantees, but I'm hopeful that at least we can sustain that.
Absolutely. Vice President Vance is in Israel today, in part to discuss next steps for implementing the Gaza ceasefire. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner are already there. What pressure or incentives is the U.S. extending to Israel to try and stabilize the situation?
So the tricky part here is, of course, that you have a two-party problem, right? You have the firing on the Israeli troops and almost immediately brings about the Israeli response. And to the degree that it was Hamas people, it probably was, but we don't know for sure. You have a real problem of pressuring both sides. The Americans, of course, have the Israeli file. They're the ones in charge of pressuring Israel. And we saw a very hard press when Netanyahu was in Washington, he made a very bold and, from his perspective, humiliating apology to the Qataris, dictated by the White House, apparently with a Qatari official present there looking over his shoulder, and President Trump essentially holding the phone. This was a dictate from President Trump, but President Trump is in the position to do so. First, American presidents in general have enormous sway in Israel. And even more so, a president who is perceived as extremely pro-Israeli and a president who is very popular on the Israeli right, and now, since the ceasefire, across the board in Israel. And therefore, his desire calls a lot. And it's both because of carrots and sticks. On the stick side, he's, of course, unpredictable. He could turn on Israel. He probably has said as much to Netanyahu, according to some reports, and at different stages. There is an MOU between the U.S. and Israel that would potentially extend the annual aid to Israel. It's expiring in a year and a bit more maybe. And we don't know if that is going to be extended. President Trump is not in love with giving people money. That's not his style. And so there's a stick there. There's also carrot. We saw President Trump give Israel enormous things, certainly in his first term. But moreover, as I said, from the political perspective, since he's very popular on the Israeli right, he carries sway and he gives a sense, a political cover. When he came to Israel and spoke in the Knesset, there was, not just because of him, it's mostly because of the return of the hostages, a euphoric feeling in Israel, and a public that was very much unified behind this, even segments of the public who were against the ceasefire because of their skepticism of Hamas and much more in line with Netanyahu's line of total victory, quote unquote. And so he is able to pass it. It's the classic one, right? Nixon can go to China and Trump can do this with the Israeli right. That is still there. The envoys, starting with Vice President Vance, but certainly Kushner and Witkoff, the power is that all three of them speak very much for Trump. And in that regard, they have a lot of power here. They are conveying that. They are conveying essentially what Trump said in the Knesset itself, which is, from his perspective, the war is over. And that is not the way Netanyahu was speaking about it. And Netanyahu has not said those words, and not in so many words anyway.
Exactly. So how well do these U.S. objectives match up with how Benjamin Netanyahu sees Israeli interests going forward?
So Netanyahu has for a long time prioritized one of Israel's two goals for this war. And these two goals emerged essentially on the afternoon of October 7th, 2 years ago, but certainly by the day or two after, which was one, the return of all hostages, as many of them alive as possible, and second, the removal of Hamas, the much bigger aim, removal of Hamas as a governing or fighting organization in Gaza. Not that it would evaporate into space. They never actually said that, or not officially said that anyway. But in the war aims, the official war aims, it was removal of Hamas as both a fighting and a governing structure in Gaza. Over time, well, from the start, it was completely clear there was a tension between the two because the hostages were the bargaining chip for Hamas, and they would not give them up if they felt that they would be removed. If they were to do that and to disarm, the war could have been over on October 8th. They clearly prioritized that they must remain as an armed resistance in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, there's been this debate in Israel about what to prioritize. Over time, it became clearer and clearer until it was said explicitly. Netanyahu prioritized total victory, as he called it, the removal of Hamas completely, and the reoccupation of the Gaza Strip with Israeli forces over the return of hostages, including at the price of many of them losing their lives. Trump, in a sense, came in, and his team is now enforcing the opposite view, which is the view of the demonstrators and the hostage families, which was prioritize the hostages, even if that leaves Hamas to a degree still in place. It's not the fighting force it was before. It can't invade Israel with thousands of troops as it did then, but there is no alternative, partly because Israel refused to create an alternative in the Gaza Strip. And it is the one now asserting its control over the Gaza Strip. Ibrahim can speak to that much better than I can. In that regard, it is the opposite view from Netanyahu. In a sense, Trump has adopted the view of the demonstrators who very wisely were calling on him and flattering him and the hostage families who've been very well organized, including here in the United States, trying to push their agenda, which is a very popular one, a majority agenda in Israel, of prioritizing the return of the hostages, now the deceased ones, over over a complete victory in Netanyahu's views, something that operationally was not really possible right now anyway, but certainly would take an enormous amount of cost, first and foremost to Gazans, of course, who live through this hard, but also Israelis.
Thank you, Natan. Ibrahim, from your vantage point, what does the situation look like on the ground in Gaza right now? And how are people experiencing this so-called ceasefire? What does a post-war scenario even mean in practical terms for people on the ground?
Well, again, thank you for having me. I think it has not yet been a post-war scenario in Gaza or reality. We just, I think what happened is there were expectations maybe the first few hours when the end of war agreement was announced, the Sharm el-Sheikh summit followed. And then from that point forward, there were as many as 78, according to local sources in Gaza, violations of the ceasefire, where Israeli troops would shoot on people, individuals, and others who would cross or come close to the yellow line, which is a very sort of like artificial line that was not even clear to people on the ground. So, like people had a very short-lived perception of an end of war. And then we got like the escalation that we had in the past 2 days. In fact, Monday was especially sort of like, a big flare-up in Gaza. And that, I think, has put people into a very skeptical view in terms of what's going to happen next. Just to go back on, in terms of how people view the situation in Gaza, obviously you have different people from different walks, from different, with different views and perspectives and opinions, like anywhere in the world. Basically, you have people who are optimistic and they want to see an end of war. Everybody is desperate and they want to see an end of war, definitely. But people are skeptical, and varies and depends who you talk to in terms of whether or not we get to that. Obviously and clearly, I think everybody knows, including governments and diplomats who welcomed President Trump plan, that the plan is not a real plan. It's basically the focus of it is stopping the war, stopping the massive bombings and killings and release of hostages, which happily happened, at least at that scale. But in terms of everything else, whether it's Hamas or Arab and Islamic governments who basically came out saying, we welcome the effort, we welcome the end of war agreement, we want to make sure that it actually stabilizes and the rest of the items or the parts or the phases in the agreement will be actually implemented. So I think lots of heavy lifting remains in place, issues that Natan spoke about in passing, but I would actually reiterate so that it actually comes clear. Hamas is ready, for example, to give up governance in Gaza, and by governance they mean actually delivery of services. But when it comes to disarmament and demobilization, that's a completely different concept that they want to have an internal discussion, and then a discussion, through with the mediators and through mediators with Israel and with the US and so on and so forth. So, now we have still the crisis of handing over all the remains of the Israeli hostages. And right after you have like equally important and equally big issues. Let's not sort of like, prioritize which one is more important. Obviously, all issues are important, but these are more difficult issues to resolve because it has not yet been agreed, not even in principle. And when Hamas declared its acceptance to the Trump plan, that was essentially under extreme pressure, and they were very specific in terms of accepting only the 9 first points, which talk about end of war, exchange of prisoners, and governance, but does not really talk about all the other issues that are still pending.
I want to talk about the sort of this fragile ceasefire and what happened on Sunday. What are the views on the ground? Did Hamas carry out the attack on the 2 IDF soldiers? Was it an active top-down decision, or does it point to sort of like a command and control issue between the leadership abroad and in Gaza and the military command of the Strip and individual units and soldiers?
In an area that is under Israeli control, Israeli army control, and some of the militias of the Abu Shabaab group, the militia that works with the Israeli army, people have different views, different opinions, but I don't really think that anyone has like true source documented, verified fact or factual version of what actually happened. But, Hamas military wing, which has, very quickly, I would actually say on Sunday and earlier Monday released the statement. Actually, earlier on Sunday released the statement saying that we have no connection with groups that actually report to us in that specific area, and therefore it's a red zone, and we're not operating there. They distanced themselves really quickly from it. Others, were actually saying that Hamas did attack the Abu Shabaab group, and during an exchange of fire, even the Abu Shabaab group fired at the IDF, with not necessarily with the intention of killing Israeli soldiers, but basically with the intention of bringing the Israeli army back into fighting with Hamas, because obviously these militias have actually been hurt badly by the ceasefire, if you will. Some of them were captured, executed, killed, pursued by Hamas, and so on. So we in fact don't really know exactly what happened. Hamas officially informed mediators that it's actually descendant groups mutiny within, some of the cells that they have operating in that area. Others are talking about lack of communications with them, some of the Hamas cells in the area. So I don't really think that there is a, like an officially verified version to what happened, but it's all indicative. I mean, regardless whether it's like mutants within Hamas, whether it's the Abu Shabaab group, whether it's random fire or a Hamas cell operating in that area under direct commands, it tells you how much the situation is still fragile, and it could actually spark violence back on any of these accounts or all of them together, because the situation is as bad. Hamas, by the way, does not really have the same central control that it used to before the war in Gaza. They are being challenged, obviously, even by militias that are appearing in public and still operate against Hamas and its forces, whether in areas that the IDF pulled out from or outside it. But those who are operating in those areas have actually fled to pockets where the IDF would still provide coverage. So all in all, I think the situation remains to be very fragile, and it could actually, it could escalate on any of those terms, regardless which one is more valid or which one did actually cause that, trigger that escalation on Sunday.
Absolutely. A delegation from Hamas met Egyptian officials recently to discuss the unification of Palestinian factions, and it's not the first time they meet in Cairo. Cairo has hosted several such meetings. Are we likely to see a different outcome this time? And what might a best case scenario of Palestinian unification look like?
Actually, the Egyptians are trying very hard to get all the factions to reach agreements, not only on issues on the political sort of like umbrella, because in the past, the discussion was about unifying Fatah Hamas, or at least like reaching a power sharing agreement. This time around, it's actually different. The Egyptians are trying hard to get Hamas to officially give up governance in Gaza once and for all. And by governance, and that I think where things will start getting complicated, it includes disarmament as far as Hamas is concerned. They differentiate between governance and disarmament, political organization that they hold the weapons and the tunnels of the resistance as they deem it and consider it completely separate from law and order security forces that are willing to actually give up. Now, before we even get there, before we actually get to a meeting, now I think there is a very rigid position that the Palestinian leadership of Fatah and of the PLO is actually putting out there, which is that Hamas needs to sign on principles of one gun, one law, one authority agreement and acceptance of disarmament before they even actually meet, which is bringing some hardships in Egypt putting together the meeting. And to be honest, I think, frankly, we don't have the luxury anymore to sit down and have days of discussions and then come back and have different interpretations and then come back and then talk about it. I mean, obviously the situation is much more explosive than it was in previous years. And therefore, now it's actually time to finish things before you even get to a meeting. I mean, a meeting is essentially to announce an outcome that would be acceptable. And this approach that the leadership is, like the Fatah leadership is taking, I think has alienated somewhat the Egyptians, who are still pushing hard. So it's in the works. I wouldn't actually say it's a foregone conclusion that they would meet. And I wouldn't even say that if they meet, that it's a foregone conclusion that they will reach agreement on. But the key difference this time, we're not talking about power sharing agreement anymore. We're talking about, like dividing bureaucracy in Gaza versus the West Bank. We're talking about Hamas giving up governance and weapons, disarmament as a precondition for inclusion or possible inclusion of Hamas into the PLO at one point if they agree in full to the PLO political platform, which includes, the two-state solution explicitly. Because, and there has been lots of arguments whether or not Hamas agrees to two-state solution, and the truth is that Hamas's declared position is that they agreed to a Palestinian state in 1967 borders without using the expression two-state because it implies recognition of Israel. And therefore, this time around, there is no place for ambiguities, and the conditions that are being placed by the leadership of the PLO and the PA are very harsh and very rigid. And without hammering those issues as quickly as possible, without intense, not only Egyptian, in my opinion, even Qatari and Turkish pressure on Hamas, I don't see this happening quickly enough. And ultimately, even if Hamas does actually reach to those conclusions and changes those kind of positions, it may not be the same exact Hamas that we know before October 6th. In other words, it could actually splinter, it could actually move in different directions. So it's a very difficult process for them to go through. And so far, all the efforts are in the works, but has not really yielded any of those outcomes yet.
Absolutely, and we'll talk in more details about disarmament and the future of Hamas. But first, let me go to Natan. Natan, with several aspects of the first phase of the ceasefire still incomplete, how is the Israeli public defining victory in Gaza now? And has that perception changed since the hostages were released?
Yes, it has. So as I mentioned before, there were two goals going in, I suppose, or immediately after October 7th, and the tension around them grew over time, especially in the past year since the ceasefire, since Netanyahu walked away from the ceasefire in March of 2025, with him and many people around him preferring what I call total victory. And I should say here, even his sort of camp has very different shades to it. Netanyahu was pushing forward a vision of a longer war, one that would somehow eradicate Hamas, bring about de-radicalization, a lot of the things that we saw in the 20-point plan, but not all of the things we saw in the 20-point plan, and certainly not the timing of it. In his coalition, the very, very far right in his coalition, especially the two notorious ministers, Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, they've been pushing for a much longer war, not only occupation, but Israeli resettlement of the Gaza Strip, ethnic cleansing in the version that Trump sort of raised, the whole deal. So against that camp, as I said, there was a very different one that prioritized the hostages, that did not believe there are essentially no Israelis who believe that the war with Hamas, the historic war with Hamas, is over in any real sense, but that Hamas is already not the threat it was before October 7th, and that Israel can guard its security and potentially go back to fighting, but it has to end this phase of the war, both because of the return of the hostages, which is an extremely big deal in Israel, or still is to a degree, and secondly, because Israel too is very weary. The damage in Israel is much less than in Gaza, obviously, but the Israelis have been fighting the longest war in their history, and it is extremely taxing on the Israeli civilian population. And therefore, the way Israelis have thought of victory has been completely split. It's in a time when Israel itself is extremely polarized, and it has conjoined with that fissure before. The pro-Netanyahu, anti-Netanyahu has been translated into this hostages first or total victory first, in a way that's been unhelpful, perhaps, to the hostages cause. But after Trump's visit and after this ceasefire, the Netanyahu sort of campaign, which is kind of an endless campaign, has immediately reframed this as a wonderful victory for Netanyahu. Even the failed attack in Doha has now been reinterpreted as the most successful failed attack in history because it brought about Qatar's pressure on Hamas, as opposed to a failure that finally brought about Trump's pressure on Netanyahu, frustrated with the attack. And so there is this kind of euphoric sense of the return of the hostages, and even on the right wing, certainly the Netanyahu brand of the right wing, not the very far right, a sense of huge success. Hamas has even had to agree, although it will never fulfill it, to disarm, etc. So that has shifted a lot. Israel is in a mindset of the war as it was is over. The military released many reservists. They could be called up again. Israel is small, but they have been released from service, quite a few of them, not all, of course. And Israel is looking forward. It's looking to its other arguments, in particular over what Netanyahu has called judicial reform, which is a complete overhaul of the judicial system that would concentrate enormous power in the executive, his own trial, the possibility of a pardon, which Trump mentioned supposedly off the cuff. Very many people doubt if it was off the cuff in the Knesset, and elections, which are scheduled to happen within a year. They're scheduled legally by October 27, 2026, and they could, of course, be sooner than that.
All right, we're gonna open the floor for questions. So if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A chat box or use the raise hand function, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. While we're still on the topic of Hamas's disarmament, Ibrahim, Natan says Hamas will not disarm. Under Trump's peace plan, Hamas was expected to disarm, yet over the weekend, Hamas officials told Reuters that they plan to retain security control over Gaza and will not disarm. How do you interpret that position, and what does this mean for efforts to destabilize or govern Gaza moving forward?
I think, frankly, all these are open questions, open-ended questions. And again, like even the Trump plan, in my opinion, did not really amply answer or put mechanisms for any of these issues. Like if you want to look at the situation closely, I think what people are not really talking much about is the fact that many of the Hamas fighters in Gaza, the remnants of the Hamas fighters in Gaza, have basically nothing left to lose. So, like it will be a very difficult process to convince those to give up their weapons, because it's becoming also about their own personal securities. Many of them have lost their houses, their families, and so on. So, like if you come to talk about disarmament versus fighting, we will either come, you either disarm or will come and get you. I think they will prefer, or they will take the come and get you, because you're not really leaving any room. If, however, we are talking about structured plan that provides alternatives, not only for Hamas, but actually for governance system in Gaza, for law and order system in Gaza, for the return of an effective, as effective as possibly can under the conditions and the situation, government system in the Gaza Strip that provides welfare, food, starts early recovery and moving to reconstruction, and all encapsulated with some sort of a process that actually unleashes some hope into a future negotiated settlement. Now, that all sounds like very wishful Palestinian thinking. Okay, it may sound like that, but on the other hand, if you want to disarm Hamas, if you want to continue the war, and if you want to go resettle Gaza, that's also an Israeli wishful thinking, in my opinion. They can go and do that, but that is not going to lead to stability. Obviously, Hamas has been, no one has very exact details on, or a survey on how much they lost, but clearly it's not the same force that actually existed before. The question then becomes whether Israel wants to control Gaza, provide services in Gaza, or have maybe an international trusteeship that would actually come and do that for Gazans. All these plans that are talked about, leaving aside and trying to impose a system against the will, not only of Hamas, I'm not talking about Hamas's positions, because to me, if you actually reconstruct and help rebuild a Palestinian Authority system in Gaza, as weak as it may sound from afar, it still has roots to legitimacy, and it still has roots to legitimacy at the Gaza local level. It's not perfect, but it's, it's not the Abu Shabab group, in other words. It's not like a collaborating body with the Israeli occupation, so to speak. It has, links to international forces and powers. Countries that have recognized Palestine recently are willing to help PA come back, return, and train with Egypt and Jordan, training Palestinian security forces, and gradually, create alternative law and order system. Help Hamas disarm to a Palestinian governance with international and regional oversight. I can go on and on. Provide pardon and alternatives for those who were engaged, combatants who were engaged in fighting, like anywhere else standard in the world. All of that, I think, is still missing and still unclear. In fact, even I was checking even today with senior Palestinian Authority officials on whether or not there are consultations on a United, like UN Security Council resolution to create the International Stabilization Force talked about. And apparently there are completely different views. The US wants to impose the whole Trump plan as is, whereas other countries want to actually talk about specific empowerment and mandate and empowerment of an international stabilization force. So in other words, the reality on the ground is really, awaiting a plausible, implementable, workable plan. And so far, I think all stakeholders are talking past each other on which priorities, and we're stuck on the ground with the violations on one hand, regardless of who starts it and why, and the fact that we're still holding, Hamas is still holding a big number of the Israeli remains. So it's backwards. And by the way, even food and entry of humanitarian supplies is controlled. Rafah has not opened yet. So, like the first chapter, if you will, is not even sealed yet. So with all of that, I think, yes, there are possibilities. There is a possibility for the concept of disarmament, but it has to actually sit right and have all the necessary incentives and packages and the alternative governance structure and the duly empowered international and regional forces on the ground to move away from that. And, again, wishful thinking, a serious political process. If all of that is not happening, then yes, I share the skepticism that it's not going to work.
All right, Natan, what lessons, if any, is Israel drawing from past withdrawals and peace efforts as it looks ahead to what comes next?
Well, unfortunately, the lessons right now are extremely skeptical of any being forthcoming on anything. The two that really stand out are, first, in the Israeli mind, loom over everything, is the disengagement from Gaza in 2005. It was from Gaza and the northern West Bank, actually. And in the northern West Bank, Israel pulled out settlements, but did not pull out its military. In the Gaza Strip, of course, the military pulled out as well, unilaterally. And in the Israeli telling, I'm not trying to adjudicate here, but in the Israeli telling, it was very clear. Israel gave the people of Gaza the choice to build their own lives with a border with Egypt. And Hamas won the following election and chose to continue its war with Israel. And therefore, in the Israeli mind, people spoke about the blockade before October 7th. In the Israeli public discourse, it's completely clear that the blockade was the result of Hamas and its war, not the other way around. And that choice by the Palestinians was devastating for Israeli willingness to contemplate taking risks and ceding territory to Palestinians. If Camp David, but especially the Second Intifada that followed, sort of destroyed the peace camp in Israel that believed in a negotiated settlement, the outcome or the aftermath of the withdrawal from Gaza broke kind of the center position of unilateral withdrawals. And that left Israel extremely skeptical of withdrawals. That's a long time ago already. October 7th now turbocharges that dramatically, because in the interim years, Israel had what we could think of as an approach of containing and deterring threats all across the board, not just in Gaza or with the Palestinians, but with Iran, with Hezbollah in particular. It was contain, deter, try to preempt, but in a sort of containable way, for lack of a better word. 10 years ago, I called it anti-solutionism in the context of the Palestinian question, which was Israelis didn't really believe, Netanyahu especially, that there's any grand solution of any kind, and therefore supposedly conflict management, of course, on the ground, they were de facto annexing the West Bank, which aggravated the problem. That was true with Iran, it was true with Hezbollah. A big lesson that Israelis have learned almost across the board after October 7th is that containment, living alongside these kinds of threats, that's out the window. They are now going to preempt whenever they see a threat coming about, and this has some logic given October 7th, right? There was a major miscalculation about Hamas's intentions and its capabilities, but of course that can be overlearned, and it has been to a large degree. And so this is what we're seeing, and we're seeing it across the board. We certainly saw even in Doha the strike, but with Lebanon, with Syria. And in Gaza, of course, throughout these 2 years, a very, very heavy hand stemming from this perception that Israel will simply not tolerate any threat emerging near it. That means that going forward, it is a very tall order, but I'll just say that there's also a psychological aspect to it. The end of the war, and especially the return of the hostages together with the end of the war, it brings them at a moment where Israeli society at least can start to heal. It's only the very beginning of something from the trauma of October 7th and the trauma of the family since then, the traumas of the war, to start to contemplate life in a different mode. And that can allow also the opening of other possibilities. We shouldn't be Pollyannish about this, that we're not going back to October 6th anytime soon. And in terms of Israeli willingness to take risks, we're in a very different place than we were, and it's not changing soon. But we can be in a very different place than we've been in the last 2 years, hopefully. And this allows, at least for the beginning, of some kind of healing, of moving forward, not necessarily in a straight line, but in a line that could allow for the opening of more possibilities in the future.
All right. I have two questions on the International Stabilization Force from Frank Lowenstein and from Liam Hamama. What is Hamas's position on the International Stabilization Force if and when the ISF is ready to deploy? Can they do it with the consent of Hamas? Would they accept a Palestinian police force to maintain basic law and order? Ibrahim, we can start with you.
Yes, I think leaving Hamas just for a second aside, the official Palestinian position on the International Stabilization Force is that they agree to it. They've even discussed certain aspects of it. They have like demands, if you will, requests in terms of what kind of force that we will have there, and basically an international slash regional duly mandated force by the UN that could actually oversee, empower, provide support to the Palestinian security forces that will deploy on the ground. So the question is that it does not have an enforcement capabilities, because that would be seen as a grave concession on Palestinian sense of sovereignty and control on the ground. That's the official position. And I think from that point, that position during, and if once we get to whether it's like a big gathering of factions or mediators working with Hamas, that is essentially the concept. That it is Palestinian security forces that will be operating on the ground, and Hamas will need to, and Hamas and all other factions, by the way, we still have Islamic Jihad and splinter groups out there that actually need to hand over their weapons and arms to a central authority, which is the Palestinian Authority, under a technocrat government or not, but essentially under the custody of Palestinian security forces, with the International Stabilization Force overseeing the process and being ascertaining and verifying and working with the Palestinian security forces. It's similar in so many ways, and I'm directing this specifically to Frank Lowenstein, whom I had the honor of working with in the past. It would be a process that would have an oversight international mechanism. So it's not easy to basically simply not be serious about or cheat in the process. This is not what it's about. This is about like creation of a body that would actually be able to report and verify every single happening on the ground. I think, frankly, again, if we end up having, let me be straightforward here, because the elephant in the room is the following: when Israel holds this position, and Israel has the veto power, no Abbas and no Hamas in Gaza, I think things get very complicated. So either you have like a disguised PA, or that the Americans will try to install some technocrat Palestinians with no relevance to to Gaza or to the West Bank or to the Palestinian Authority. All these options, in my opinion, can be imposed. The Palestinians are not a superpower to stop them. Don't get me wrong, but it will fail on the ground. It's not going to deliver what it actually needs. You need roots of legitimacy, and that's what you have, in the Palestinian Authority, and an empowerment of a technocrat committee. The whole concept was designed in order to bypass Israeli opposition to it by saying temporary for 6 months, because in a Palestinian context, technocrats cannot impose law and order and security in the same way that the legitimate political powers can, and therefore there is no escape from empowering a Palestinian Authority, in Gaza, in order to get to medium-term and longer-term stability. Now, if there are countries who are willing to send troops to fight Hamas on the ground in place of the IDF, that's a different matter, and I don't speak on behalf of other countries. They may want to do that. I frankly, have no comments on that if it does happen. But what I do know in a Palestinian context, there is an alternative to what you have currently in Gaza, and that alternative needs empowerment by the international community. And let's not forget that, due respect to President Trump and his plan, there is the New York Declaration Plan, which includes the DDR, Disarmament and Demobilization Reintegration Plan, by the way. So if you don't really bring all those mechanisms into life and implement them on the ground, then the reality is going to be harsher decentralization. Some people like to call it Somalization of Gaza, fragmentation, breakdown of the society, breakdown of law and order as much as we have it already. Um, and getting back is not really an easy thing. In short, international stabilization force to empower, support, supervise, and have oversight the process of bringing back law and order and disarmament and resumption of Palestinian governance is welcome. An alternate power to the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas forces on the ground in a form of a foreign occupation is not welcome. As simple as that.
And you think Hamas would accept a Palestinian police force if it was deployed in connection with the
I don't want to, I don't want to like go into nuances and details of Palestinian internal dialogue, but I think Hamas does not really have much choices in the context of a national Palestinian dialogue. National Palestinian dialogue will have to bring in the whole issue of disarmament, not only as an Israeli security need, which is a legitimate Israeli security need, but it also needs to be presented to the Palestinian people as a means of bringing back life, early recovery, reconstruction, and a longer term, a political solution to the Israeli, occupation of the territories, including Gaza. That's the Palestinian context where Hamas will have to, basically stand up against, with regional support, with international pressure, with empowerment of the Palestinian Authority. I think, Hamas's position will start to frail and actually break down. Now, their position in terms of either, either you disarm or we'll come and kill you, that's an easier thing, frankly, to confront, because they will lean on the part that no, we will fight you back kind of position. But when it comes to all these interests, with alternative packages, with disarmament packages, with incentives, the idea of bringing Hamas, and many people are talking about political parties and sort of like transformation into a political party, so it becomes a completely different political entity, no militias, no weapons, no that. All of these are issues that will be discussed in an internal Palestinian context, and Hamas will have hard time, standing against it. And I think not only that, it's not only that the Palestinian Authority will be able to impose these, it's actually the entire region and the international community. So I find it extremely difficult when you provide Hamas with plausible alternatives that they would actually continue to say no, even if this leads to their fragmentation and splinter, which is for many people might even be a desired outcome. But without that, if it's like only we will kill you either today or later, I think that's doomed to fail, because it does not really give incentives for people to, whether in Hamas or in the Palestinian Authority, to actually press with a more acceptable standard kind of process of demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration.
All right. We have a question for you, Natan, from Paul Sham. Paul wants to know, can you judge whether Hamas is genuinely trying to return the bodies of the remaining hostages, or whether it is Israel making bad faith complaints?
So first, hello to Paul Sham. I don't think in this context it's bad faith claims. The Israeli claim that Hamas knows about a lot more of the remains is backed up with very specific evidence that has been shown to the mediators. And so in this context, it's not an empty statement. It's a very, very specific one. Israel has had a very large, robust, and extremely professional operation within the military to follow every intelligence they could about the hostages since day one. It's headed by maybe the most capable Israeli Reserve General Natan Sachs. Full disclosure, he was a fellow a long time ago at a think tank in Washington, and I worked with him. But he has zero pretense, and the intelligence that they have been providing to the not that he speaks to me, just to be clear, I have no intelligence knowledge, but the intelligence that they provide to the mediators has been very specific. So in this context, no. That is not to say that the Israelis think that Hamas knows about every single one of the remains. They do not. Gaza is in ruins, and there's a lot that cannot be uncovered. But they firmly believe, and I think are backed up with very clear evidence, that there's many more that Hamas could retrieve, even if it is not the full 13 that are still remaining as of this recording.
All right. A question for you, Ibrahim, from Dennis is, are Gazans prepared to be governed by any entity other than Hamas?
I think people have assumptions on, many people would actually tell you that a large portion of the Gaza population wants an end of war period. They want that normal life. And you hear that quite a lot in Gaza when you talk to people and individuals. But at the end of the day, I think, basically we still have a hardcore base support for Hamas and what it stands for. And that, I don't think that one should actually deny that. I think, frankly, as Natan was earlier addressing, Hamas has like a governance structure and a military capability and fighting, which is the military wing. The third thing that actually Hamas does have is the political organization. Terrorist political organization, fine, but it's a political organization at the end of the day that has supporters, that has, even beyond Gaza, West Bank, even beyond, like Jordan, elsewhere around the globe. And that, in my opinion, I think where Hamas's strength and possibility of recovering from the whole thing could actually come back, not necessarily in the form of another military wing, but basically as a vibrant political organization. But, in order to actually get to the right track, I think basically one of the key lessons and conclusions is that, after the war, getting back to normal life without eventually finding a political resolution to the conflict through a process of negotiations, I'm afraid that Hamas and other radical organizations will continue to grow in despair, hopelessness, continued occupation. Narratives of conflict that will last until end of days are not so alien to ideological. I mean, it's not only in Israeli or Jewish or Christian, it's also in Islamic ideologies. And therefore, I think this is like a turning point. If the process of bringing back life to Gaza goes through empowerment of the moderate camp, we, I think, collectively will be able to build back hope in the hearts and minds of Gazans, West Bankers, and others. If we end up in the same space and in the same spot where we were and where we were during the war and where we are today, then I'm afraid that this would actually, like the momentum that could be built on that will actually go backwards, and we will go back to the same square. If I may, I just want to comment on the 2005 unilateral disengagement from Gaza, because, I was at work at that time, and I just want to, I don't want to debate it, but I just want to point out that when it was presented as almost as a punishment to the Palestinians that we will pull out unilaterally from Gaza. And there was a total Israeli political rejection to the concept of negotiating that process, negotiating, not coordinating that process with the Palestinian Authority. Like Prime Minister Sharon refused even to have one single meeting with President Abbas at the time. And therefore, it ended up being a unilateral Israeli, as it's known, disengagement from Gaza. The problem was, in my opinion, that's from the Palestinian side, that when this happened, the Hamas narrative was the one that actually resonated very strongly, which is the Israelis pulled out from Gaza because of the second intifada and the violence inside Gaza, and they couldn't protect their settlements anymore and their settlers anymore. And the narrative was built like that, paving the way for Hamas as the victorious, and then, went through the elections and things got complicated. Today, if you ask my, this is not only a Palestinian perspective, in fact, it's an objective perspective, in my opinion. Anything that needs to happen, if it's not, if you do not empower the moderate Palestinian camps on the Palestinian side, the end result, again, will actually be strengthening radicals rather than actually helping and empowering moderates and pragmatists. I'm not sure which way the Israeli society will go in upcoming elections, but I think there are still partners, both in Israel, as weak as they are, and both on the Palestinian side, as weak as they are, for the possibility of creating a different dynamic. And I'm not saying two-state solution overnight. I'm not naive. I'm just saying you need to encourage and strengthen and support positive dynamics on the Palestinian side after this war, rather than continued, sense of despair and hopelessness. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Natan, in recent days, we've seen reports of gang violence and public executions in Gaza. Is this an attempt to reassert dominance? And is there a danger that Gaza could evolve into a Lebanon-like scenario with Hamas playing a role like Hezbollah?
There's a real danger, and this stems from a fundamental failure, I think, partly on the Israeli side, not only, but certainly on the Israeli side too, of envisioning victory over Hamas, not just in the military sense of destroying its military capacity, which was a necessity, certainly after October 7th, but also from a political perspective of, as quickly as possible, creating an alternative that would come in. And that alternative could have been in many different forms. I agree with Ibrahim that dismissing Abbas, which was a very early move by Netanyahu, and was not an obvious one, I think, among the full Israeli leadership in the beginning, and it became obvious later after Netanyahu made that position. It closed a lot of doors. Now, it need not have been Abbas himself or even forces explicitly tied to Abbas. It could have been other forces that of the general secular Palestinian camp that had affiliation to the Palestinian Authority today or in the past or in some context. And there were partners in the region who could have helped with that as well. But they needed to come in very quickly with the means to stabilize the civilian aspect of things, even while Israel was operating on the military side. And the lack of that, now that would not have guaranteed any success, just to be clear. The Hamas was still very capable of undermining this. It's proved its capacity to do so for decades now. But that would have given a much better chance to create a different kind of basis. Right now, the possibility of a Lebanese kind of model, it's worse than Lebanon in many respects, sort of from a human perspective, but from a political perspective, this Hezbollah model, as many refer to it, meaning that there would be an official or semi-official government that in charge of civilian affairs, perhaps with some security capacity, like in Lebanon, but that the biggest force would be Hamas, just like Hezbollah for decades now has been the biggest force in Lebanon, perhaps, of course, changing now as a result of this war. That possibility is not only not only possible, it is quite likely, and it is if there was an alternative civilian structure. And it is one that should worry us all, because that would be a recipe for continued fighting. Sooner or later, Hamas will have different incentives, or inside Hamas, there will be different incentives. And of course, the Israelis, as I said, are in a very, very low tolerance state of mind. That is true not just of Netanyahu, it's true across the board, although in different ways. And therefore, when they see deviations, they will hold Hamas responsible. And to be clear, when the Israelis view Hamas as responsible, if Hamas is essentially coming back into the Gaza Strip, in the Israeli mindset, and this was certainly true before October 7th, as I said, in their understanding of the disengagement, Gaza was a statelet. It had a border with Egypt, and many organizations in the world can decide that it's occupied somehow by Israel, and Israel controlled every aspect of life, that's a direct quote. And yet somehow controlling every aspect of life, an army of thousands invaded Israel from that statelet. So from the Israeli perspective, that was sort of absurd, and that governs how they think of it going forward. If they see Gaza as a statelet, and that statelet, even if it's completely in shambles, that statelet with one big force, Hamas, just like Hezbollah in Lebanon, they will view that governing structure, Hamas, as responsible, and that could lead to a very heavy response again to any kind of violation of the ceasefire, be it specifically from Hamas people or someone else, because Israel will think even if it's Islamic Jihad or a splinter in some neighborhood, that is Hamas's responsibility to clamp down on it. As had happened many times in the past decade and a half, Hamas would clamp down when there was violations of ceasefire for fear of Israeli retaliation. I worry that we're coming back into that kind of mindset.
All right. Ibrahim, a question for you from one of the attendees. You mentioned earlier employing Palestinian technocrats in Gaza's transition. How would this body of technocrats be decided and formed? They'd like you to elaborate on what you mean by the moderate camp within Palestinians.
The moderate camp, in my own opinion, and very objectively, I'm myself is like a secular person, and I think that we have a wider network of Palestinian people who are not necessarily ideological. One of the biggest problems that we had over the years, I think, is the fact that people are still, when it comes to overall politics and representation, are still being held hostage, if you will, to national liberation movement. And that means that you have to have a program that addresses the Israeli occupation, either by violent means or non-violent means, and everything is like so confined to that. I'm hoping that moving forward, going to technocrats and going to even better, creating a new political party law, which is being discussed in civil society and also like in official circles, to give a platform. 70% of Palestinians are under the age of 40, which actually means that they never participated in elections, not in 2006, and definitely not in 2005, and definitely not in 1996. And therefore, there are lots of Palestinian talents, and technocrat people and skillful people who could actually jump in, form political parties, and start working. And this is a process that will have to evolve. I'm not talking about like a change in society overnight. It's again a process where I think the international community, you would even argue that certain powers within Israel have an interest in longer term stability with the Palestinians and finding ways to resolve the conflict, and therefore encouraging voices and skills and talents that have not yet been part of all this mosaic of armed resistance versus violent resistance. It's all about resistance, but in fact we also need state and national statehood building. No Palestinian, by the way, is going to give up the dream and aspiration of ending the occupation and having a state of their own, even if it takes another 1,000 years. This will continue to be the national motto and dream and program and belief. Like the argument has been, whether you actually go about it by violent means, like Hamas has been arguing, or you do it the national secularist way, which I think is represented by the other groups, but also by many speechless and voiceless younger generation Palestinians who have not really been given the platform to do that. And I think like time will tell, but I think there are efforts, and I think we need international and regional support to actually. By regional, by the way, I'm implicitly including Israel, because in my opinion, stability on the Palestinian side, moderation, what the Israelis rightly call de-radicalization of the Palestinian people, is an Israeli interest. But I think trying to do that while maintaining occupation and control versus finding ways to gradually end the occupation is where we differ, or where I differ. I, by the way, Natan, watch Israeli media a lot more than I actually watch, Palestinian media. And in certain parts of the Israeli debate, in fact, I want to just point to it. And I think whenever there is a board of inquiry that will look officially into what happened, almost 2 decades of Hamas's governance in Gaza was not in complete vacuum of an Israeli supportive role. And the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli defense ministers, and others were basically helping, channeling funding to Hamas, thinking that this would do a conflict management with Hamas in Gaza and that the situation will be fine. This is one of the things that, in my opinion, should actually draw a lesson again on whether or not and what type of a process you want, with the Palestinians. But that's an Israeli affair. From Palestinian perspective, I think there are partners to coexistence with Israel, to a two-state solution, even if gradual. It doesn't have to be overnight. A process that starts with separation, this engagement, bilateral, not unilateral, bringing in international forces, stabilization forces, monitors, even with Israeli participation. That would not really be a blockage. The issue is, so far, the way we see it is that there is an Israeli ideological government or 2 ideological ministers in Israel who impose an ideological agenda that we see happening in the West Bank, let alone Gaza. And then, there is no consensus yet in Israel on starting a process that would actually lead to end of conflict. Until we get there, I share your concerns, what you described in terms of violations, ups and downs. All of that is still likely to happen, and the Palestinian Authority will not be able, and technocrats will not be able to impose their will on Hamas while they are themselves are not empowered. The PA today has basically a part-time work schedule. We're like in a shutdown, but permanent almost, as opposed to the US. The PA has no money because the Israeli Minister of Finance decided not to actually give a penny to the PA since May, let alone all the previous finances. Now you can imagine if the PA is unable to manage the West Bank, that they would actually go and manage Gaza. So again, we need support and help, cooperation, in order to be able to deliver on the very same issues that the Israelis actually want to see, both in Gaza and the West Bank.
All right, let me conclude with one final question for Natan. What would it actually take to build the kind of trust needed for any new political framework to take hold?
That's a very hard question because trust is something that is very easy to destroy and very difficult to build. So what I want to suggest is that a lot can be done through changing some of the realities on the ground, even short of trust. You, of course, need some trust, and that's often where mediators come in. So you see even this ceasefire, there is zero trust between the parties. Israelis do not believe that Hamas will play any kind of constructive role of any kind. And we see Trump coming in. They have no trust in the PA, honestly, by and large. I'm talking very broadly about Israelis, but the consensus view is certainly one that does not have any trust in the Palestinian Authority as well. But they do trust the Americans, and via the Americans, and also to a larger degree, they have trust in the Egyptian capacity to do things and some of the other mediators. So a lot can be changed if reality on the ground is changed well before any trust, quote unquote, between the parties is created. And we should also be very, this is a broader theme. I'll just make one last point, which is, I think when we think often of peace, we have in mind the peace of the 1990s, or the promise of peace of the 1990s, which was this capital P peace, this grand harmony that through trust-building measures, confidence-building measures, slowly the parties will come together more closely, and they will understand each other's narratives, and we will have reconciliation and end of conflict. That would be wonderful if it ever happened. But my suggestion is that we have to think much more modestly about what peace could mean. There's also lowercase p, peace, which is the absence of war. And there are cases that are not resolved. Cyprus is not resolved by any means. The capital is divided. It's half occupied, according to many people, according to the European Union. Nonetheless, no one has died in Cyprus from the conflict this year. And if we just aim for that, start for that, with the intention of going forward beyond that, but it might be a very long intention, we can get very far. The situation right now is so dire in so many places that any improvement, even if it is very small and if it does not promise us capital P peace, can still be extremely valuable. And that does not require great trust or great harmony. It requires institutions, verifying measures that can improve the situation on the ground in very real ways, with an eye towards the political, not just daily life. That, I think, is certainly possible. But we have to be both humble and extremely vigorous in pursuing what is possible.
Thank you both so much. We've reached the end of today's webinar. Thank you for the audience, for the great questions, and thank you for your valuable time and insights. We hope everyone has enjoyed today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you in our next session.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.